100,000 light years in diameter. Even if we could travel at the speed of light, it would still take 100,000 years to travel from one side of this great unknown to the other. But what if I told you there is a way you could explore almost the entire Milky Way within your lifetime, without having to worry about achieving light speed? There's just one small caveat. You must be able to maintain a constant 1g acceleration. That's the same force as Earth's gravitational pull. If, however, your hypothetical spaceship could maintain such a near impossible level of unrelenting acceleration, then you could, due to the effects of time dilation, travel to the centre of the Milky Way and back again in just 40 years. But when you return to Earth, it would be 60,000 years in the future. Also, if you could maintain that elusive 1g acceleration, you could reach the edge of the observable universe in a single human lifetime. What you would actually do when you get there remains to be discovered. Picture this. It is the longest hour of your life, and also the heaviest. In all of 4 hours and 35 minutes, 1,000 lifetimes would pass by on Earth. Generations would be born and inevitably fade. Yet, to you, all of a single afternoon would have passed you by. This would be your experience if you spent just one day on an imaginary planet in the ghostliness of space. 1,000 light years from Earth, let's call this imaginary planet ZR42A, which is just a modicum catchier than GQ Loopy B, currently the largest exoplanet we have discovered, estimated to be up to 36 times the mass of Jupiter. But let us imagine that ZR42A is 1,000 times as massive as Jupiter, and thusly 317,800 times as massive as Earth. Gravity increases linearly with mass, so, therefore, gravity is 317,800 times as strong on ZR42A as it is here on Earth. With that amount of force acting upon your humble frame, your skeleton would be crushed into a pile of dust faster than you could see quicksand. It would be equivalent to bludgeoning an egg with a sledgehammer. But let us throw the laws of physics into a cautionary black hole for just a moment, and imagine that you could walk uninhibited upon this faraway rock in space. In Einstein's theory of relativity, he proposed time is not a constant, it is neither a force, but a material interwoven with physical space. Space-time, as it has come to be known, is akin to an elastic band, which can be stretched and contracted at will. It can also be bent. Time, therefore, is relative to the mass and, consequently, the gravitational pull of the closest and most massive object to you. There are Arctic terns that could migrate to the other side of the planet before I could finish explaining special relativity and general relativity in suitable detail. That's if I could. 12,000 miles they migrate, twice per year if you were interested. But for now, let us assume a basic premise, that if you were to stand on this imaginary ZR42A, that time would progress slower for you than your brethren back here on Earth. This phenomenon is called time dilation. As gravitational force increases, so does the bending, warping, and hence dilation of time itself. When you have a weaker gravitational field, time flows faster. A stronger gravity causes time to trickle slower. But only from your perspective. So, if you were to travel from Earth and stand upon the surface of ZR42A for a single afternoon, upon your return, everyone you knew and loved would be long deceased. Your home planet would be unrecognizable. Thousands of years would have passed, but to you the smallest flicker of an afternoon would be all that you had experienced. An unfathomably surreal afternoon, but an afternoon nevertheless. This effect isn't just perceptionary, it is as real as the butter upon my bread, and yes, it is actually a form of time travel. For in those short few hours, you wouldn't have aged at all. Upon your return to an Earth many thousands of years older than you left it that very morning, your body would have aged only a few hours. In reality, time dilation isn't quite that powerful in the vicinity of most planets. This preceding example is knocking on the decidedly delicious doors of science fiction. But time dilation does exist. If you were to stand on the largest planet in our solar system, Jupiter, then for every second that passed by on your watch, then 1 second and 20 nanoseconds would pass by back on Earth. That's not even enough to affect the timing of a boiled egg, never mind the age dynamics of your relations, but it is unquestionably present. Jupiter is large, really large. 1,300 Earths could fit inside of Jupiter. If it were hollow, which it most definitely isn't, I checked, although it is rather mushy. But a mass certainly doesn't have to be unfathomably large for the effects of time dilation to start messing up your interplanetary schedule. Near the event horizon of a black hole, the point in space-time where the gravitational pull of the black hole becomes so powerful that you can no longer escape its grasp. Time dilation could very well cause your minutes to turn into hours, possibly even years, back on Earth. All this means that if you were somehow able to defy the relentless pull of gravity and avoid the minor inconvenience of massive spaghettification, you could travel forward in time by spending just a few hours at this exact point in space, within the grasp of a black hole, but never quite slipping forward. If you were able to make it back to Earth, that is, in one piece. Now, if we're getting technical about it, you wouldn't have actually travelled through time at all, but time would have passed by at a different speed back on Earth relative to you. Hence, relativity. Nothing at all is safe from time dilation, not even the Earth itself, or even your ankles. Let me explain. The pull of gravity gets stronger the closer you get to the incredibly dense core of our planet, a core which is approximately 2.5 years younger than the surface. But what about your vulnerable ankles? Well, they also will feel a slow grind of time dilation. If you were to wear a watch on your ankle and another one on your wrist, then over a number of years, many thousands, the watch on your ankle would fall behind your wristwatch, simply because it is closer to the immense source of gravitational force that is the Earth beneath your feet. If all these time phenomena I have so far discussed have not yet left you inebriated in a cerebral overdose of factual soup upon your very own floor, then prepare yourself for yet another heavy dose of factual medicine. Every effect I have talked about thus far is caused by something called gravitational time dilation. You see, time dilation is more of a double act. It comes in two flavors, gravitational and velocity-induced. We have already outlined how huge masses can warp space-time itself to slow down the flow of time. But so can one's velocity. According once again to Einstein's theory of general relativity, a person's perception of time is relative to the velocity at which they are travelling. This effect, which is hard-coded into our universe, is most apparent when two objects are travelling at different velocities, especially if those objects happen to be timekeeping devices. In 1971, 3 physicists flew around the world twice with synced atomic clocks to test out the time dilation theory. Upon meeting up once again, they found that all 3 of their clocks disagreed with each other, thus proving the theory. Time dilation has to occur as a fundamental, unbreakable law of the universe, in order to keep the speed of light as a constant. The speed of light is the great constant, the greatest equalizer, whilst the waist size of the latest Big Brother winner inevitably and frequently varies, as well documented in a selection of trashy magazines named after English greetings. The speed of light will never do as such. There are other constants such as Planck's constant, but none are as unshakable as c. In physics, c denotes the speed of light in a vacuum, 300,000 kilometers per second. The speed of light is the great comparator in many crucial equations. If the speed of light were to change by just 0.0001%, it would throw off everything we thought we knew and have, as a species, worked so hard over the past millennia to uncover about our current understanding of the universe and everything it contains. So time dilation exists as a fundamental property of our universe to ensure that if one's velocity changes, then time itself must slow to maintain the constant speed of light. The speed of light accommodates no one or no one thing. Everything, including space-time itself, must make extra special accommodations for this universal equalizer. To understand how time can differ so substantially depending on a person's location and velocity, you must take everything you imagine about how time behaves and then turn it all on its head. Naturally, we think of time as a river flowing downhill towards the heady, relentless pull of the future, inevitably and often unforgivingly so. But Einstein posed that time doesn't flow as we feel it does. The encroaching future that is so omnipresent within our life experience is no more than an illusion, an impressively sophisticated one, according to general relativity. Einstein famously said the distinction between the past, present and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. Instead, think of time like a train with an almost infinite number of carriages. The first carriage is the moment and the location of the Big Bang, the birth of the universe. Conversely, the last carriage is the last point in space and time of our universe, the point of its inevitable death. You can only see the people and the events happening in your carriage. This is your slice of time. Your present, a moment in the space-time continuum that you share with all the other passengers in your train carriage. But passengers in different carriages, behind and in front of yours, will have a different perspective of their present. Their slice of time, their now, will be entirely different to yours. Their present could be your past, or it could be your future, depending on the location within the train. Einstein theorized that through the mechanisms of gravity and velocity-induced time dilation, we can move to a different carriage upon the train. And thus, our anchor within space and time, our now, shifts by one or more carriages, depending on the velocity with which we are travelling and the gravitational force of our current surroundings. However, this example suggests a potentially unnerving truth. If time does behave in this way, it would also mean that time is not something to be decided and altered. It is a static medium which we simply move through. This could mean that everything that has happened and everything that is yet to be has already happened. Every tale has been foretold. Every fortune has been realized. The future is not ours to make. It is a destination to reach. We cannot change what lays ahead in the train carriages in front of ours. We can only await the point in time and space when we will naturally reach that carriage. Each and every day is a page in a book that has already been written. But before you fall into an abyss of self-pity over your suddenly immutable future, do bear in mind that this is not fact per se, but our current best working model for how the universe behaves based on popular theories. Importantly, Einstein's equations indicate that time has no direction bias. It prefers to flow neither forwards nor backwards, not even sideways if it were inclined. Yet we inextricably experience time going forward. There is a sensational difference between what we experience as the past and the future. Time has no preferred direction, so naturally physicists have been pondering this. What seems like a deep flaw within our universe. And it transpires that what we believe is the passing of time, the steady rolling of the wheels of the future, isn't the future at all. There is no past and there is no future, because time has no direction, at least not within the realm of existence that we call our universe. As Einstein said, time is an illusion. And in the words of a great science fiction writer, lunchtime, doubly so. The passing of time is no more than a psychological illusion, a trick the world around us plays upon our brain. What in fact we are experiencing is the terrifyingly stubborn process of low entropy becoming high entropy systems. In thermodynamics, entropy is the measure of the order or disorder within a system. It eloquently describes the nature of all things that will eventually succumb to the decay and fall into disrepair. With all things in the universe, from a distant star to a ham sandwich, there are many more ways that the particles within said thing can become disordered and fall into a chaotic abyss than there are ways that it can remain ordered. The star will eventually die and implode into a dense singularity, and the ham sandwich will, less spectacularly, but just as inevitably, grow mold and decompose. Entropy explains why buildings will always decay over time. Equally and unfortunately so does the human body. Therefore, what we perceive as time passing us by is no more than the decay and the unstoppable onslaught of chaos in all around us. People and animals dying, buildings and nature decaying. All these examples of entropy fool us into vesting wholly into a grand illusion that we are approaching some kind of future, when in actuality, if popular science is to be believed, then the future is not a point in time, it is a point in the vast continuum of space-time. And it is not ahead or in front of us, it is in no particular direction at all. We are not travelling forward, no matter how hard our brains toil endlessly to make it thus. Thank you for watching. If you thoroughly enjoyed this video, then please consider clicking the join button below to join the private 42 community here on YouTube, where you'll get early access to all my videos and private vlogs from myself.
This episode is supported by LegalZoom. As our video games become more and more lifelike, it's becoming clear that at some point, perhaps soon, our simulations will be indistinguishable from reality. If that's true, how do we know it didn't already happen? Could we be in a simulation now? Before I get into details, I want to share with you a conversation I recently had about this idea with my colleague at the Hayden Planetarium in New York City. In fact, with its director, Neil deGrasse Tyson, along with comedian Eugene Merman as part of Neil's Star Talk radio show.
Emilio Zusa, on Instagram. How about the recent articles about the possibility of us being part of a simulation and the Big Bang being just the seeding event of such simulation? Thanks!
I'm totally there.
Yeah.
I'm digging it every minute of it. You don't like it?
I want to hear your opinion.
I'm loving it.
I want to hear this.
I'm loving it.
Well,
So who made the simulation?
Some snot-nosed kid in the parents' basement of an alien civilization who's bored and they're more advanced than we are, and they have way more computing power than we are.
Right, so it's like a little handheld Nintendo you can...
Exactly, and so they program in enough detail to completely simulate every molecule in this universe, and we are here for their entertainment. Why else can you explain where things are going along just fine in the world, that all of a sudden there's a complete disruption?
The snot-nosed kid.
Culturally, politically, economically, a complete disruption. I think they throw it in for entertainment. That's what I think.
Okay, I'm going to say, I have two things to say. Firstly, I predict that you don't believe that. That's my first prediction.
Okay.
But I don't want to put thoughts in your head.
There's an argument for why that's more likely than any other scenario. I'll tell you that in a minute. But
the numbers game. Okay, so the idea that if you need to produce one universe capable of producing universe simulations,
and that's all you need.
And if that universe produces billions of universe simulations, then any universe that you happen to find yourself in
is more likely to be one than the one universe that started it all.
The way that virtual reality now exists exists and, video games have advanced, it is likely that in, say, 1,000 years, whatever our virtual reality would
or
be...
30 years.
30 years. I was being generous.
30. Yeah.
Well, 30 years, that whatever it was would potentially be physical. Like, you would be able to feel it.
Okay, so it wouldn't. It doesn't even require that. No, it just requires that what you program in there has in your Nintendo, whatever it is, has enough complexity that in the mind of the characters in that game, they think they're real.
Right, so
and have free will.
It can't simulate the whole universe, because to simulate the universe perfectly, you need a computer the size of a universe.
Do you?
Do you?
Yes.
I don't know.
Because, assuming it's a perfect...
The conversation goes in lots of fun directions. You can check out more on Star Talk Radio, link in the description. Now, Neil uses an entertaining example of us being a Sims game for hyper-advanced alien basement dwellers. That's a hilarious image, but he's illustrating a very serious point. That under certain assumptions, virtual minds should vastly outnumber real minds in our universe. If so, shouldn't we be virtual minds? Let's dive deeper into this rabbit hole and decide if this actually makes sense. But before we do so, we should be clear about what type of simulation we're talking about here. Let's avoid the idea that the entire universe is simulated, right down to every atom, electron, or vibrating quantum field. That is a much deeper rabbit hole. One will need the holographic principle to explore. It's a whole big thing, and we'll get back to it. Instead, today I want to talk about the idea that it's our experience of the universe that is simulated, that we are simulated minds in a virtual universe that has just enough detail to convince us of its reality. I'm talking about so-called ancestor simulations, an idea proposed by Oxford University's Nick Bostrom. It goes like this. Bostrom argues that in the future it'll be possible to simulate the action of all the neurons of the human brain and to simulate the sensory input to that brain with enough fidelity to convince the simulation that it's a real person. Now, that's not too much of a stretch. There's a good chance we'll be able to do that within a generation or two. However, Bostrom crunches the numbers to show that a super advanced civilization could do this on such a scale that these sorts of virtual minds vastly outnumber real minds. Why would they bother? For science. He proposes that an advanced civilization may want to run simulations of its own history to study the behavior of the types of minds that lived that history. He calls these ancestor simulations. Let's look at the numbers. The human brain has 100 billion neurons and well over 100 trillion synapses. It's been estimated that the entire operation of a single brain could be simulated with somewhere between 100 trillion to 100 quadrillion binary operations for every second of time that the brain experiences. Bostrom argues that it doesn't take anywhere near that much computing power to then simulate an external environment with the fidelity needed to fool the virtual brain that its environment is real. That's debatable because the environment needs to be perfectly consistent with respect to all measurements made by all brains in that environment. But whatever, let's go with Bostrom's assumption. A full ancestor simulation would simulate all humans that ever lived. Going back, say, 50,000 years, it's estimated that around 100 billion people have lived and died. An average 30-year lifespan gives each of them a billion seconds, and each of those seconds requires 10 to the power of 14 to 10 to the power of 17 operations. Multiply those numbers together and you get 10 to the 34 to 10 to the 37 binary operations to simulate all of human history. Bostrom says 10 to the 33 to 36, but potato, you can mess with any of those numbers and still remain within those few factors of 10. So, how long would that take to compute for a super advanced civilization? Well, Bostrom uses Robert Bradbury's estimate that a computer the size of a large planet, a so-called Jupiter brain, would be capable of performing 10 to the power of 42 operations per second. In other words, it will be capable of simulating the entire mental lives of all humans in history 1,000,000 times over, every single second. Just one such computer would generate an insanely large number of lifelong mental experiences that are indistinguishable from the type of mental experience that you and I are having right now.
2020 will no doubt be a big year for science. It's a new decade, and at times like these, we often take the opportunity to look back and see how far we've come. Scientists who came before us made sure our food and drugs are free from poison and built the devices that make our modern lives possible. So as we forge ahead into the new year, let's take some time to thank the intrepid researchers, volunteers, and even the occasional dog who got us to this point. First up, imagine volunteering to be poisoned in the name of making food safer for everyone. That really happened in the early 20th century. These experiments weren't terribly safe or ethical or rigorous, but they are the reason you can be confident your food doesn't have washing powder in it. Let's go to Stefan for more.
I think we can all agree that food is pretty great. So participating in an experiment where almost all you have to do is eat 3 delicious meals every day for up to a year sounds kind of like the dream. But imagine knowing that hidden in one of the foods, maybe the butter, maybe the freshly picked peas, is a substance that's probably toxic. It sounds unthinkable today, but that was the setup of some of the strangest and most infamous human experiments in American history, known as the Poison Squads. They ran for 5 years starting in 1902, and even though they wouldn't pass any scientific ethics committee today, they were revolutionary at the time because people started to realize that maybe they should make sure the things are safe to eat before eating them. The trials were the brainchild of Harvey Washington Wiley, the head chemist with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Back then, food additives didn't have to be tested or even put on labels, and he wasn't really okay with the idea that no one in America had any way of knowing what they were actually eating unless they had grown or raised it themselves. Formaldehyde, for example, regularly popped up in milk to keep it from souring. Yeah, the known carcinogen that we use to preserve dead bodies. And you'd also often find borax, a mineral that contains sodium and boron, in meat. It made the meat firmer, which made it seem fresher, especially when combined with an extra pinch of salt and red food coloring. These days, borax is a common ingredient in things like detergent and pesticides. And we're not talking tiny, insignificant amounts of this stuff either. But no one had bothered to investigate whether these additives were actually safe to eat. So with $5,000 from the government, Wiley hired a chef, promised a bunch of otherwise great free food, and recruited a dozen healthy young men as volunteers. He took their weight and vitals, made them collect their urine and feces, and gave them weekly physicals. Then they started with a low dose of a specific chemical and went up, stopping only when the men were too sick to continue. The first Poison Squad tackled borax and its derivative boric acid, because they were so common. At first, the chef hid the chemicals in butter or milk, but the volunteers could taste the metallic flavor and instinctively avoided it, because no one wants to eat butter that tastes like their silverware. Wiley still needed the men to get the right dosage, so he just put the borax in pills for them to pop about halfway through their meals. Bon appetit. The guys on the Poison Squad reported stomach pains and feeling less hungry when they were fed 2 to 3 grams of borax a day. At 4 grams, they became very tired, developed headaches, and couldn't work normally, which sounds like an average Monday to me, but apparently in their case it was caused by the borax. Through other trials, Wiley also found that if they took a lower dose of half a gram a day for long enough, they'd get similar symptoms. Today, we know that eating borax can cause tissue damage, which can eventually lead to fun things like vomiting and convulsions. So thanks for saving us from that one, Poison Squad. Thankfully, though, almost no one walked away from these experiments with any obvious long-term problems. Wiley also tested copper sulfate, which was added to things like canned peas to make them bright green, as well as formaldehyde, sodium benzoate, and salicylic acid. And while the effects on the men varied, Wiley concluded that none of the additives were safe. Today, any scientist looking back at these trials would be horrified by not only the ethical problems, because giving people potentially deadly substances, even if they know about them, is never okay, but also the poor experimental design. For one thing, the participants knew they were eating a potential poison, which could have easily skewed the symptoms they reported and made them feel more sick than they actually were. Not to mention that for the most part, the experiment had no real control group. In between testing each substance, the squads were given a break for several weeks, but they weren't asked to continue reporting symptoms or to keep collecting their urine or fecal samples. You also can't really conclude much from a small and specific group of people. Wiley thought that if healthy young men got sick, the same chemical would also be unsafe for women and children. It's not really how biology works, though, and a few dozen white guys didn't exactly represent all of America. But even though there were a lot of flaws with this experiment, it was the first time somebody thought to test food additives and study them one at a time. Later research that was actually reliable led to almost all of these additives being banned from food, except for sodium benzoate, which is a common preservative in acidic foods like orange juice and soda. But we only use it because we've tested it and it's considered safe. And journalists loved covering the happenings in the DC lab kitchen, so people across the country started thinking seriously about the things that might be used to preserve their food. In 1906, partly because of the public's new awareness, Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, a precursor to today's more rigorous regulations. Those concerns also led to the creation of the FDA, which is the organization that makes sure the ingredients in your food aren't going to kill you. For the most part, anyway. If you decide to crack open 10,000 cans of baked beans, there's not much they can do to help. That one's on you. Since Wiley was so instrumental in protecting America's food, he's often called the father of the agency. So the poison squads were a really horrible idea and full of sketchy science. But because of the progress we've made since then, going to the supermarket today is a whole lot safer.
I don't know, I hear formaldehyde-laced beans are pretty tasty. A lot of our historical episodes have looked at medicine and health. Maybe that's because saving a lot of lives is a pretty good way to be remembered. But it's not just drugs that have changed our lives for the better. Like, all the work that went into bringing you the phone that's probably in your pocket right now, or at least somewhere within arm's reach. Before phones, the ubiquitous pocket electronic device was the calculator. Less glamorous, sure. But there's a lot going on with that little 4-function piece of plastic your teachers passed around in elementary school. Here's Hank with more.
We don't think of pocket calculators as being all that special these days. They're cheap, easy to use, and your phone can do all that stuff anyway, right? But the development of the pocket calculator mirrors the electronics revolution that brought us smartphones and modern computers. In fact, some technologies we now take for granted found their first widespread use in electronic calculators in the 1960s and 70s. And the first sort of compact electronic calculators couldn't fit in your pocket. They were the size of a typewriter and demanded so much power that they needed a wall outlet. For example, the Anita Mark 8 was available in the early 1960s and cost as much as a car at the time. It performed basic arithmetic functions by using vacuum tubes, basically airtight chambers with filaments inside, which could shuttle electrons in precise ways to generate currents and act as switches. The name was short for either a new inspiration to arithmetic or a new inspiration to accounting, which gives you a clue as to who bought these expensive machines. But soon, there were a couple of major technological leaps that revolutionized calculators and also the rest of electronics and of the whole world. First, for calculators to become cheaper, more portable, and less fragile, vacuum tubes were replaced with transistors and integrated circuits. A transistor functions like a gate for electrons. Basically, by applying electrical power, it can either be opened or closed. These binary states are still the basic idea behind all electronics. And typically, transistors are made from a material called a semiconductor, which sometimes conducts electricity and sometimes doesn't. Early transistor electronics, like the super popular transistor radio for consumers, would string individual transistors together in series. Transistors were way smaller and sturdier than vacuum tubes, but more complex devices like computers were still fairly big. In the late 1950s, though, engineers invented the integrated circuit, a single semiconductor chip that had all parts of a circuit on it, including many transistors. One of those engineers worked at Texas Instruments. The company knew it had something good on its hands, but struggled to find a good consumer outlet for these compact chips. That is, until 1965, with the design of the first prototype electronic pocket calculator. It was codenamed Caltech, measured about 10 by 15 centimeters, and could perform the 4 basic arithmetic functions: addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. Its chip required the equivalent of thousands of transistors. They even built a version for testing without integrated circuits, which, according to one designer, took up an entire 2-tiered, 2-meter tall desk. So integrated circuits really packed a punch. These days, we call them microchips, and we put them in everything. Caltech also printed out results on a roll of tape using a thermal printer. This was also pretty new at the time and worked by basically melting text into a special type of paper like the receipts you get at the grocery store. The TI team actually wanted an electronic display, but that technology wasn't great yet. LEDs at the time had poor visibility. LEDs work based on passing an electric current or field through a semiconductor, which causes electrons to shift around and emit light. The color of the light can be altered by introducing different elements, which is easier said than done. It's taken decades to make LEDs in every color of the rainbow. Early on, gallium and arsenic-based LEDs were only capable of emitting infrared light and very dim red light because of the way electrons move through those particular particular elements. Lots of pocket calculators after the Caltech did feature red LED displays, but they demanded a ton of battery power because those early systems weren't very energy efficient. The next revolution in calculators was the liquid crystal display, or LCD. Liquid crystals have molecules that are free to move like a liquid, but can settle into an ordered state like a crystalline solid. Dual identity means they can block or transmit light, and switch between states rapidly when there's an input like electricity. That's why we...
Well, that's that. here, and we got some more biology.